Welcome back to Did You Know? CIUS Answers. With us today is historian Dr. Frank Sysyn. Dr. Sysyn is the director of our Toronto CIUS office and director of the Patriarchate Center. Welcome, Frank.
Hello.
The Ukrainian Ministry of Culture has terminated the lease of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for the Kyiv Monastery historical site. This request to vacate has been contested by the church and caused considerable discussion about the freedom of religion in Ukraine. Would you be able to provide the historical background on this question and discuss the current situation?
Yes, I will try to do so. And I think these are quite complicated questions. I direct our viewers to both look at the Internet Encyclopedia of Ukraine, as well as a number of monographs that CIUS has put out through the years. We will, during this Easter season, see more attention to Ukrainian church affairs, both by correspondents in Ukraine and commentary on the West. And I think there are two different issues, one of which is trying to understand the complexity of the situation in Ukraine. And the other is the different situation in Ukraine from what our viewers in Canada or the United States might expect in both religious issues and issues of ownership. I think what is most important to remember is all of this is a background of large-term attacks on the churches and abolition that have occurred over the past 2 or 3 centuries. First of all, in the Tsarist Empire, the Ukrainian Catholic or United Church was entirely banned and abolished, and no Ukrainian Orthodox Church was permitted. It was only with the breakdown of the Russian Empire in 1917 that a Ukrainian church movement was formed, which formed a Ukrainian Autocephaly or self-ruling Orthodox Church by 1921. And what we must also remember is the Soviet state and the Communist Party were opposed to all religion and attacked all religious groups and abolished them to a great degree in particularly the 1930s. But it's somewhat differentiated among religious groups. The Ukrainian Independent Orthodox Church was entirely abolished by 1930. But the Russian Orthodox Church, which had existed in the Tsarist Empire, is to a great degree restored by Stalin in 1943 for purposes of the war. And then when the Soviet Union takes over the Western Ukrainian areas, the Soviet state forces the abolition of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and forces all believers of Eastern Christian groups into the Russian Orthodox Church. So on the one hand, they attacked religion generally and undermined the Russian Orthodox Church, but particularly in Ukraine, they allow that church to exist as both an agent of Russifying and integrating it into the Soviet state. And that was the situation that existed up until the end of the 1980s. Ukrainian churches were banned in Ukraine. They existed in the Ukrainian diaspora. And these diaspora churches kept those traditions. And then in the time of glasnost and perestroika, Mikhail Gorbachev begins to withdraw the various anti-church legislation and practices in the Soviet Union. Churches are reopened at that time. Now, what Gorbachev started, of course, also meant that in Ukraine, those who had always been followers of the Ukrainian churches, particularly the clandestine Ukrainian Catholic Church, see this as an opportunity to come out of the underground. And those Ukrainian Orthodox believers who had always wished to have an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church see themselves as related to the Ukrainian independent churches, which had existed in the 1920s, and then again for a short time in Ukraine under the German occupation. Now, that meant that by around the year 1989 and 90, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine was facing a tremendous crisis. A great percentage of all of its parishes, perhaps as high as 50%, were in Ukraine. And it was in Ukraine that suddenly believers were withdrawing and trying to take the church buildings, particularly in Western Ukraine, where they had been Ukrainian Catholic churches, with them. That is, to repossess them, since they had been forcibly integrated into the Russian Orthodox Church. It's at that time that the Russian Orthodox Church decides it must stop the outflow of believers that's occurring in Ukraine. And it decides to rename what had been called its exarchate, or a special jurisdiction in Ukraine, and call it the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It did so by issuing a special decree from the Patriarch of Moscow. And that decree then said that although this church in Ukraine was connected to the Orthodox world through the Moscow Patriarchate, and was to a great degree still integrated into that patriarchate, that it would have administrative autonomy. And it even puts into this decree words like samostiny, independent, nezalezhny, in fact in Russian, but not in Ukrainian, trying now to say that there is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, something it had denied for all the years of the Soviet rule. Now, the purpose was quite clear. It was to stop the losses. But it did not even give this church autonomy. There are in the Orthodox world only two kinds of recognized church structures. You can be autocephalous, that means you are truly an independent and equal member of the community of Orthodox churches, or you can be an autonomous church within another church, having considerable rights. This Ukrainian Orthodox Church did not even get autonomy from the Russian Orthodox Church. And that was the situation when Ukraine became independent. And the head of the church in Ukraine, Metropolitan Filaret, with the prompting of the Ukrainian government and Leonid Kravchuk, try and follow what was a pattern that had happened many times before in the Orthodox world, when countries became independent, that is, on their own. They then wanted to establish independent Orthodox churches. And we see in the 19th and 20th century the granting of autocephaly in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, in the 20th century in Poland and later Czechoslovakia. This is attempted in Ukraine, but fought by the Moscow Patriarchate and fought by the Kremlin at that time. And in fact, it does not succeed. And you may ask why it does not succeed. In part because those believers who already believed they should have such a church had already left for the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, which had returned from the emigration. But the other reason was, to a great degree, this church in Ukraine had been Russified, had been integrated into Russian thought, and thought of itself as a Russian institution. It did not really seek full autonomy, and certainly did not seek autocephaly. And so, as Ukrainian governments changed in the next 20 years, it depended on whom they wished to support. In the case of the Kuchma government, more likely to support this kind of Ukrainian Orthodox Church related to Moscow. That changes in the Yushchenko years, when there's hope again that there may be a grant of an independent Ukrainian church. It goes back in the Yanukovych years, particularly tied then to the idea of the church being somewhat integrated into the Russian world. Now, what adds to this issue was the issue of property and congregations. In the Soviet Union, of course, all property was owned by the state. In practice, land remained so, and congregations had the right to use church buildings and then build them, and tended to have a group of usually called 20 who had control over these congregation buildings. What also adds to the complication in Ukraine is that many of the great and ancient churches, above all the Kyiv Monastery of the Caves, but also the great monastery of Pochayu, Świętochirsk, which has been much in the news as being destroyed by some of the bombing in Donbass. These are architectural monuments and had museums in the Soviet period and are seen to this day as being still general cultural property of the Ukrainian people and protected by the Ukrainian state. So in practice, the church is given use of these buildings, and in some cases not full use, as such the great cathedral of St. Sophia, where it might do damage to bring it back into full normal liturgical use, but is given so on a lease or on a contract. And in most cases, these great monasteries and churches were turned over to this Ukrainian Orthodox Church that was part of the Moscow Patriarchate, and not to the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and not to the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, or a second independent church that's formed called the Kyiv Pechersk. Now, when does this all change? It changes greatly after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the time of the Maidan. This was a time when church organizations were very active in Ukraine, active in supporting, or in some cases not supporting the Maidan. And in particular, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate tried to play to both constituencies. There are some very unfortunate statements that come in that period from Metropolitan Onufri, who heads that church, saying, not wanting to admit there is a Russian invasion and calling this a civil war. He also had a record of earlier, when he was in Bukovina, of saying that the famine or Holodomor had occurred in Ukraine because of the sins of people of that time. And this raised great controversy for this church and its adepts. The other thing that's going on at this time is that the church in Russia, above all led by Patriarch Kirill, increasingly becomes involved in the Russian world ideology, a vision that is promoted by Putin and the Kremlin government, but also closely related to the church, that sees the Russian Orthodox Church as the center of the Orthodox world and places it in confrontation to Western civilization, and also argues that it, as an institution, still has the right to make decisions for the neighbors of Russia, and in particular for Ukraine. Now, all this changes in the time of Petro Poroshenko's government, when Poroshenko, himself originally a parishioner of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Moscow, decides that the Ukrainian state needs to have an independent Ukrainian church, negotiates with the Ukrainians' mother church in Constantinople, and comes to an attempt in 2018-19 to call all the Orthodox bishops of Ukraine to form a true autocephalous church. Regrettably, the bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church do not join. The other Ukrainian churches do. And at that point, the mother church gives autocephaly to Ukraine. There is, from that point, very important in the Orthodox world, not only an independent Ukrainian church, as there had been earlier, but one that is recognized by the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople and followed then by the churches of Greece and Alexandria and Cyprus. Now, I realize that's quite a complicated story, but it's very important because it gave then legitimacy to that Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Then comes the election in which Zelensky and Poroshenko run, and Poroshenko makes the issue of the church still a central issue in that election. Zelensky, on the other hand, is very far at that point from church affairs, very little interested in it, largely surrounded, I think, by a quite secular group of a younger generation. When the Zelensky government comes in, it backs away from the church situation. And therefore, it leaves a divide in Ukraine in which there is a recognized now independent autocephalous church, and the church under Moscow, or still connected with Moscow, continues as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Everything changes with the full-scale attack on Ukraine on the 24th of February. At that point, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, headed by Metropolitan Onufry, condemns the attack on Ukraine and makes an appeal to Putin to stop this war. And this poses for this church tremendous problems, in part because the territories that Russia attacks and first takes frequently are those territories that are not only Russian-speaking, but are territories where that church is particularly strong. Regrettably, are a considerable number of clergy within those areas of this church who collaborate with the Russian occupiers. And that includes bishops within that church as well. This also places those who have been closely allied with the Russian world ideology in this church in a difficult situation. Most notable of them is Metropolitan Pavlo, with the last name of Lebed, Petro Lebed, who is the head of the acting head of the great monastery of the Caves. Generally, he was known as quite a scandalous clergyman. It was well known that he had great wealth, he was involved with business, he had made various curses against various political groups. It was generally, one would have thought that this church would have removed on its own desire to, let's say, improve its image. Regrettably, that was not done by the church. We also have, within this situation, institutions like the Pochayu Great Monastery in Western Ukraine, which had regrettably become proponents of a rather strict and someone also might call intolerant form of orthodoxy, as well as relations with the Russian world. Now, this also involved the issue of what language the church uses. The traditional language of the church was Church Slavonic. It had a relation to Ukrainian or Russian, somewhat similar to Latin to Italian. It had been used for centuries, but wherever Ukrainian Orthodox churches had been formed in the 1920s, again in the 1940s, they had argued people should understand the liturgy and use Ukrainian. The independent or the Orthodox Church of Ukraine predominantly uses Ukrainian. The church under the Moscow Patriarchate, on the other hand, predominantly used Slavonic, and indeed frequently in its preaching used Russian. That was frequently used, I might add, by Metropolitan Onufry at the Caves Monastery. Another issue that comes up at this time is, what will the churches be called? And in many ways, what happens is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, to many people, was assumed to be a fully Ukrainian institution. The government in 2019 adopts a law that says that since this church is a component of the Russian Orthodox Church, it should call itself such, and therefore there be clarity on this issue of name. And that has recently been reaffirmed by the Ukrainian Constitutional Court. Why was this also important? Because everywhere after the Tomos, or the grant of Autocephaly by Constantinople, came, churches were transferring from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under the Moscow Patriarchate to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the new autocephalous one. And as I pointed out, one of the issues was the congregations could decide this transfer. The question then became, who are the congregations? In villages, frequently people viewed everyone baptized within the church was a member of the congregation, whether they were a frequent churchgoer or an occasional one. But increasingly, we were finding that the church allied with Moscow was trying to limit membership, say only those who were frequent churchgoers or closely allied with the clergyman should have the right to decide. And you can look online and see many videos of village meetings where decisions are argued of should we transfer or shouldn't we transfer. In the eyes of the law, that transfer was the right of the congregation. Although frequently the priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate did not want to recognize that. There are great changes that occur in May of 2022 when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate meets and decides that it will cross out almost all of the articles which tied it to Moscow that were part of its original charter. And yet, on the other hand, its link to the Orthodox world, its recognition remained through Moscow. It isn't even an autonomous church. So this gave it a very unclear status within the Orthodox world, and it was unclear even to its clergy and parishioners who asked for clarifications as to whether their church really had separated from Moscow, and to what degree was that separation legal. Now, what has also, I think, not occurred over that time was the church did not fully put its house in order. It had those groups who had been allied to the Russian world ideology, to various oligarchs, the most famous of them, a man named Novinsky, who had a Russian citizen who had become a Ukrainian citizen. It had bishops who had Russian citizenship, and it had the scandalous head of the Kievan Caves Monastery. Now, the Ukrainian government of Zelensky, I think, tried to stay away from the church issue in its early years. And even after May of 2022, there was hope that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, now insisting it no longer had ties with Moscow, although still connected canonically to Moscow, would indeed change its direction and at least address the issue of the collaboration of some of its bishops, of the anti-Ukrainian statements that had been made. Those only happened really very slowly. But what involves the Ukrainian state in this issue is frequently the land under the churches and near the churches are still the property of the Ukrainian state. And in the case of the Great Caves Monastery, there is a lease that was done in the time of Yanukovych, who favored this church allied with Moscow, which had given a long-term lease to control the Caves Monastery. But in fact, it remains still a museum, and the issue of how that property was used, what buildings were built or destroyed, all were very important. In many ways, the church had viewed itself as able to do as it wished. And particularly that was a tradition that came from the Yanukovych years. And now it was put into question. And so what begins to happen, and now has happened, is the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture has said, you have broken the terms of the lease, and therefore we would like you to vacate both the upper caves and the lower caves. The upper caves, where the great cathedral of the Dormition is located, has already been vacated. We now deal with the issue of the monastery, which has monks, the theological academy, all of which now have been asked to leave that territory as it no longer is under the control of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. As well, with the decision of the Constitutional Court, the issue of whether that church should be called Russian Orthodox has returned. Now, I think many have seen in recent days the explosion in the city of Khmelnytsky that occurred in the cathedral. This is a video which has gone through all Ukraine, and in which a wounded soldier returned to the city of Khmelnytsky, an area in the western more areas of Ukraine, but not in Galicia, called out in the church how long will you continue going to the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate? How many of our soldiers must die? And then he was badly beaten by a number of servers in the church. These were not largely this was not primarily the priests who did turn somewhat against him, and not even ordained deacons, but other such groups. And this video absolutely catalyzed opinion in the city of Khmelnytsky. By the evening, 3,000 people had gathered outside the cathedral to demand justice for the soldier. And above all, argued that no longer will we allow our church to be allied with a church, part of this church that is part of Moscow. Now we enter this issue of who has the right to vote and decide. And while in villages, these are easier decided, in cities, it is harder. There are many churches, there are no membership rolls. In Khmelnytsky, immediately 1,500 people signed to change. The questions are who has the right to change. At the same time, Ukrainian governments of cities, rayons, are everywhere calling for withdrawal of property from this church, and in some cases for banning the church for its past activities. And here we come close to the issue of religious freedom. That is, they do not have the right to ban the church. They, in many cases, have the right to take away property from the church. That they can do. We also see this. A recent funeral in Bukovina, in the far west of Ukraine, was a case, I think, which resonated throughout Ukraine. It was a case in which a soldier who had died in the war was being buried outside of the village church because it was still controlled by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that formerly of the Moscow, or still of the Moscow Patriarchate. And a mother begged that this son be buried, who had been buried, a religious server in this church, buried in the church. And finally, although this church 4 years ago had already transferred to the independent Ukrainian church, it had been stopped by various processes and still was controlled by the priests allied to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Eventually, it is broken into by the congregation to carry on the service within that church. I think that gives us a feeling of how this is operating throughout Ukraine. Now, we now have reached a very difficult period. It is clear that public sentiment throughout Ukraine has risen greatly against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, traditionally allied to the Moscow Patriarchate, and which by law now should be called the Russian Orthodox Church. There have been uncovering of all kinds of literature that is anti-Ukrainian in the libraries of this church. It is common in the various confrontations for congregations to call these priests the Muscovite priests, even in a less Moskovsky Pope in Ukrainian. And this is much objected to by the church. The argument is made that many of its followers are fighting valiantly for Ukraine, that in many cases priests pray for Ukraine and for their constituents. And yet the church at the moment has a very bad reputation. We will see what will be happening in the next week. There will undoubtedly be whole new sets of transfers and attempts to look into this church. But above all, things will be centered on two of the great Lavra, the Kyiv Pechersk Lavra, where so far the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has kept its seminarians and its monks illegally on the grounds of the Lavra. The question is, will they leave themselves? Metropolitan Paul, or Pablo, has been put under house arrest for 60 days. And he has cursed not only the president of Ukraine and his family, but he has been caught on tape of, say, positively evaluating the Russian capture of Kherson. So there will be questions of his trial. So I think we can see that this will be a major issue. On the other hand, that church of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will insist it has the right to name itself, and it should have the right for religious freedom. We also may see this happening at the Pochayo Monastery. As of today, the Verkhovna Rada came with its first statement on this monastery. It is a monastery particularly complicated because in the 18th century belonged to the Uniat, or what we would call today Ukrainian Catholic Church. It then was an Orthodox monastery. It is a huge complex, and it is owned by the Ukrainian state as a museum. The question will be, will its lease be seen as broken now? And if so, how the state will deal in perhaps more justly apportioning the access to such historical monuments of the churches of Ukraine. Chernihiv is another city where this has occurred, where indeed there was a point where the sacred relics apparently had been taken out of certain of the major churches. So Ukraine is going to be the center of world attention on this issue of religious freedom, on the naming of the churches, and the relationship, above all, of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as it calls itself, which has been by an expert commission declared as part still of the Russian Orthodox Church, and its relationship to Patriarch Kirill and the Russian world.
Thank you, Frank. You have highlighted the true complexity of this issue, and we will all need to stay informed as the situation with the churches in Ukraine continues to develop.